The Middle Ages are often remembered through the lens of kings and queens, castles and knights, holy wars and plagues. But beneath the surface of those crumbling stone walls and candlelit chapels lay a secret world, one far stranger, more twisted, and more shocking than the stories carved into history books. It was a world where religion ruled every breath, every thought, every body, where sin and salvation danced on the razor's edge. And yet, behind the rigid walls of morality, desire pulsed like a forbidden fire. In the shadows of monasteries, in the chambers of nobles, in the dirty alleys of medieval towns, sex was both obsession and terror. But this was not love as we know it, not intimacy as we might imagine. The medieval era was a breeding ground for bizarre practices, rituals, and punishments that blurred the line between pleasure and pain, salvation and damnation. To understand them, we must step into that world as it truly was, raw, unfiltered, and deeply disturbing. The church cast its eyes upon every act of the body. Desire was sin. Lust was a gateway to hell. And yet, no matter how hard priests preached against it, human hunger for flesh found ways to twist, to survive, to thrive in the strangest forms. The stricter the rules, the darker the secrets became. Imagine this. The year is 1347. The Black Death sweeps across Europe. Entire villages vanish in days. The stench of death clogs the air. And what do the survivors do? Some fall to their knees, flagellating themselves with whips in the belief that pain might cleanse their lustful souls. Others, terrified by the end of days, plunge into wild orgies, desperate to taste the flesh before the plague claims them. That was medieval reality, between fire and ash, between piety and indulgence. The obsession with sex in the Middle Ages was not hidden. It was everywhere, coded in laws, whispered in confessionals, written in secret manuscripts, painted in the margins of holy books. Monks who transcribed Bibles sometimes doodled obscene drawings in the edges of sacred texts, tiny naked figures, grotesque sexual scenes, creatures coupling with humans. Historians call them marginalia. But to those monks, they were perhaps a secret outlet, a silent rebellion against vows of chastity. And yet it was not just drawings. There were acts that shock us even today. Take the bizarre medieval practice of chastity belts. Popular legend tells us knights locked their wives into iron underwear before marching off to war, keys hidden in their armor, so no lover could touch them. While historians debate how widespread these devices really were, records and preserved examples suggest they existed, if only as tools of humiliation, control, and sexual torture. Imagine being locked in one, skin rubbed raw, unable to relieve even the most basic bodily functions. To men of that time, it was protection of honor. To women, it was a cage of pain. But chastity belts were just the beginning. The medieval obsession with controlling sex birth punishments that were designed not just to harm, but to humiliate. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to ride backward on a donkey to the town square, naked to the waist, jeered at, spit upon by her neighbors. Men guilty of unnatural acts could find themselves publicly branded or castrated. In some cases, couples caught in illicit affairs were buried alive together, condemned to rot in each other's embrace. It was a brutal paradox. Society feared sex, yet could not escape it. Priests delivered sermons railing against lust. Yet confessions revealed that even they fell into temptation, sometimes in grotesque ways. Monasteries, supposedly places of holy purity, were whispered to be dens of forbidden acts, where monks and nuns, cut off from the world, turned inward on each other in desperate secret couplings. When discovered, punishments were swift and merciless, lashes, exile, or worse. But it wasn't all punishment. Some medieval practices reveal a strange merging of sex and ritual. The flagellants, for instance, believed that scourging their bodies cleansed them of sin. But as they whipped themselves bloody, some experienced something else, ecstasy. Pain became a kind of twisted pleasure. Witnesses described groups of men and women half-naked in the streets, lashing each other with leather straps, moaning, trembling, caught in something that blurred the line between religious frenzy and sexual release. And then there were the fertility rituals. In villages across Europe, peasants believed that crops would grow stronger if couples copulated in the fields under the moonlight. Some festivals openly celebrated the body, disguising lust as sacred renewal. May Day dances, for example, often evolved into wild coupling in the woods. The green man and fertility gods invoked as excuses for indulgence. The church condemned these festivals, but the people clung to them. For the peasants who feared famine, sex was not just desire, it was survival. But perhaps the most shocking of all medieval sexual practices lay in the courts of nobles and kings. Behind the curtains of velvet, power twisted desire into games of cruelty. Chronicles tell of feasts where lords entertained themselves with naked servants forced to perform grotesque acts for amusement. Some nobles even commissioned sex manuals, filled with illustrations of positions and practices forbidden by the church. One such text, The Secret Garden of Pleasures, whispers its way through Europe, offering a peek into the most scandalous desires of the upper classes. Yet, for all their secrecy, these acts rarely remained hidden forever. When scandals erupted, they burned across the land like wildfire. The guilty were punished not only by law, but by spectacle. Public shaming was the most potent weapon of the medieval world. Stocks, pillories, whippings in the town square, all turned private sin into communal entertainment. For nothing thrilled a medieval crowd more than seeing their neighbors humiliated for lust. The most grotesque punishments were often reserved for what the church called unnatural acts. Bestiality, sodomy, even masturbation. These were treated as crimes against God himself. In some regions, men accused of such acts were executed by fire, their ashes scattered as warnings. Women were not spared. A woman found guilty of bestiality might be tied to the very animal and burned alive. These punishments, written in chilling detail in medieval law codes, reveal a world obsessed with controlling the body through terror. And yet, despite the fear, despite the horror, desire never died. It could not be killed. It lived in whispered stories and obscene songs sung by drunk peasants at taverns, in the secret lives of men and women who defied the rules. The medieval world was not only shaped by knights and kings, but by the flesh, hungry, sinful, unstoppable. These times was not simply haunted by strange sexual practices. It was governed by them, and at the heart of it all was fear. Fear of the body, fear of damnation, fear that the secret whispers of desire might pull an entire society into chaos. Yet fear had a twin, obsession. The very thing priests condemned from their pulpits was a thing they could not stop talking about. Lust was branded as sin, but in every law, in every sermon, in every punishment, sex was the unspoken center of medieval life. And when sin was discovered, justice came not only with pain, but with spectacle. Consider the medieval punishment for adultery. In some towns, a guilty couple was stripped naked and paraded through the streets while the crowd hurled rotten vegetables, spittle, and insults. Sometimes they were chained together at the neck, forced to stumble side by side, while children beat them with sticks. This was not just justice. It was theater. The crowd delighted in humiliation, savoring the downfall of neighbors who had dared to indulge in flesh. But the punishments could be far worse. In Germany, records tell us of a punishment called the cucking stool. A woman accused of sexual misconduct was strapped into a wooden chair and dunked into a filthy river or pond again and again, her body shivering and gasping before being pulled up, only to be plunged back under. The water was often contaminated, filled with waste. It was meant not just to punish but to degrade, to strip dignity from the accused until she was broken. Even more grotesque were the punishments reserved for what medieval law called sodomy. The term was broad, often used to describe anything outside of procreative sex. In Florence, men caught in same-sex acts were branded with hot irons. In England, records describe executions by hanging, the condemned bodies left swaying as warnings. In some parts of Central Europe, sodomites were burned alive, the flame seen as purifying fire. But it wasn't only law that shaped these practices, it was the church. Priests listened to confessions that revealed the darkest corners of medieval desire. One man might admit to lusting after a neighbor's wife. Another might whisper of self-pleasure. A woman might confess to thoughts of desire she could not control. The penances handed down ranged from endless prayers to brutal self-punishments. A sinner might be told to walk barefoot across frozen ground. Another might be ordered to flog themselves every night until their skin bled. Yet behind closed doors, even priests and monks fell prey to temptation. Chronicles tell of monasteries where unnatural acts were discovered, the brothers stripped, beaten, and expelled. Nuns, too, were not immune. Stories circulated of convents where women, isolated from the world, turned to each other in desperate need. When such scandals were uncovered, the punishments were savage. A nun might be walled up alive in her cell, a tiny hole left for food until she starved to death in darkness. And then there were the strange medical practices tied to sex. Medieval physicians believed that female desire was dangerous if not released. Some claimed that a woman's womb could wander through her body, causing madness, unless satisfied. Treatments often involved bizarre rituals of stimulation, conducted, ironically, by male doctors sworn to chastity. These so-called cures blurred the line between medicine and exploitation, between healing and indulgence. But perhaps the strangest of all were the fertility rituals that mixed sex with superstition. In some villages, barren couples were told to copulate in graveyards at night. The spirits of the dead called upon to bless their union. In others, women hoping to conceive would bathe naked in rivers during sacred festivals, believing the flowing water carried life. Men smeared their bodies with strange potions made of herbs, animal parts, and even ground bones, all in the desperate hope of potency. Desire was everywhere, but so too was terror. For those accused of witchcraft, sexual acts became weapons of accusation. Women were accused of coupling with demons, of flying naked to midnight orgies with the devil himself. The infamous witch trials of Europe often centered on supposed sexual depravity. Under torture, women confessed grotesque acts: copulation with beasts, with Satan, with spirits. These confessions were torn from them by pain, but they fueled a frenzy of fear. Witches were stripped, searched for devil's marks, and burned at the stake. Their supposed sins turned into flames that lit the night sky. In the courts of the powerful, however, sexual practices became games of dominance. Kings and nobles used their position to indulge in forbidden pleasures, often shielded by their status. Chronicles whisper of rulers who kept harems of mistresses, or who forced servants into acts of humiliation for entertainment. Some courts staged elaborate masquerade balls where nobles, hidden behind masks, indulged in acts that blurred the line between celebration and debauchery. Yet not even nobles were safe. When scandals erupted, the consequences were explosive. One French queen was accused of adultery with multiple men. The accused lovers were executed brutally, some dismembered, others burned alive, while the queen herself was imprisoned. The message was clear: even the highest born could be dragged through the mud if they strayed too far. But not all medieval sexual practices were about punishment or sin. Some were rituals of indulgence, so strange they bordered on the surreal. In certain feasts, nobles demanded that food be served by naked servants, the banquet itself performance of power and desire. In some regions, peasants celebrated spring festivals by staging mock weddings where couples engaged in symbolic sexual acts before the community, believed to ensure fertility for crops and livestock. Still, the punishments remained the most haunting part of medieval sexuality. One of the most grotesque was the punishment for bestiality. A man found guilty of coupling with an animal was executed, but not before the animal itself was put to death as well, burned or buried alongside its human partner. The logic was twisted. Both were guilty, both must pay. Equally brutal was a punishment for women accused of adultery in certain towns. Records tell of wives forced to wear iron collars inscribed with their crime, locked in place for days while the community mocked them. Others were whipped through the streets until their backs were raw. Some were stoned to death by neighbors who believed they were cleansing their village of sin. Yet in this darkness, a strange truth emerges. The medieval world was not devoid of desire, but consumed by it. Every law, every punishment, every ritual revealed just how obsessed society was with the body. They tried to control it, to punish it, to bury it beneath fear, but they could never destroy it. By the time we reached the late Middle Ages, something strange had happened. The body, once seen as a temple, was now viewed as a battlefield, where lust waged war against salvation. And in that war, no weapon was too cruel, no punishment too bizarre. The medieval mind saw sex not just as pleasure, but as danger. Every forbidden act was believed to invite demons, to crack open the gates of hell itself. And so, punishment became not just justice, It became ritual. Public humiliation was a fire that society believed would burn sin away. One of the most grotesque rituals of shame was the skimming ton ride. In England and parts of France, a man accused of being dominated by his wife, or worse, cuckolded, was paraded through town sitting backward on a donkey, sometimes wearing horns on his head. Crowds followed, banging pots and pans, laughing and jeering. But the punishment wasn't limited to men. Women accused of adultery or loose morals could be forced into the same ride, stripped of clothing, paraded as living warnings. It was not only punishment. It was humiliation turned into carnival, and the punishments grew darker still. In Germany, records describe women accused of promiscuity forced to wear shame masks, iron contraptions shaped like grotesque faces, with long tongues or animal snouts locked around the head. These masks cut into the flesh, left scars, and made even breathing painful. The purpose was simple: to mark a woman forever as lustful, as sinful, as less than human. But punishment was not always about iron and fire. Sometimes it was about spectacle. In some towns, couples accused of adultery were buried alive together. The crowd would gather, throwing dirt on them as they suffocated in each other's embrace. It was a cruel irony. Their desire for each other condemned them to rot together in the earth. The medieval obsession with sexual sin didn't stop at the living. Even the dead could be judged. Chronicles tell of corpses exhumed and put on trial for sexual crimes. Their bones were displayed, their reputations shattered even in death. To the medieval mind, sin had no expiration. It haunted you beyond the grave. Yet, perhaps no figure was more entangled in bizarre sexual accusations than the witch. To medieval society, witches were not only heretics, they were seductresses. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum described in chilling detail how witches supposedly copulated with demons, stole men's virility, or used spells to seduce priests. Women accused of witchcraft were stripped naked and searched for devil's marks, birthmarks, scars, or moles that were seen as proof of Satan's touch. The searching itself was invasive, humiliating, and often sexual in nature. And under torture, confessions poured out. Women told inquisitors what they wanted to hear, that they had flown to midnight orgies, that they had lain with beasts, that the devil himself had taken them. The confessions were fantasies forced by pain, but they were believed as truth. And so, women were marched to the stake, burned alive while crowds gathered to watch their bodies twist and scream in the flames. To the church, it was purification. To the people, it was both terror and entertainment. But not all sexual practices were condemned. Some were celebrated, though always in strange and unsettling ways. Consider the Feast of Fools, celebrated in parts of France. During this festival, rules were inverted, priests dressed as women, and debauchery spilled into the streets. Records describe processions filled with obscene songs, lewd gestures, even simulated sexual acts. For one day, lust was not punished but performed, sanctioned under the disguise of carnival. And then when the feast ended, punishment returned with double force, as though society sought to cleanse itself of its own indulgence. Then there were the secret manuals. Hidden away in monasteries and noble courts, texts circulated that depicted positions, rituals, and acts forbidden by the church. Some were illustrated, showing bodies intertwined in ways shocking even today. One Italian manuscript, known as I Modi, depicted couples in 24 different sexual positions, accompanied by erotic poetry. It was banned, destroyed, hunted down, but copies survived, hidden like treasures of forbidden knowledge. To the medieval mind, such books were dangerous, for they revealed that desire could not be contained by law or faith. And if desire could not be contained, then punishment had to be relentless. In Spain, the Inquisition turned sexuality into a weapon of control. Men accused of sodomy were not only burned, but sometimes mutilated first, castrated before being tied to the stake. Women accused of sexual witchcraft were paraded naked through the streets, their hair shaved, their bodies scarred before the fire consumed them. Every act of punishment carried a message. Flesh is sin, flesh must suffer. But beneath this terror lay hypocrisy. Chronicles whisper of inquisitors who, after condemning women for lust, privately took advantage of them in prison cells. Kings who punished men for adultery kept countless mistresses. Priests who preached against sin fathered secret children. The medieval world was built on contradictions. Desire condemned in public, indulged in private. Even more bizarre were the rituals of the flagellants. These groups, convinced the plague was punishment for lust and sin, marched half-naked through towns whipping themselves until blood streamed down their backs. But witnesses described something unsettling. As the whips cracked, as cries filled the air, the gatherings often turned frenzied, bodies pressed together, moans mingling with prayers. What began as penance sometimes ended in something darker. Pain and ecstasy blurred until even the holy became obscene. And there were darker still corners. Secret societies and cults whispered to indulge in sexual rites under the cover of night. Though evidence is scarce, accusations alone were enough to destroy lives. Men were accused of selling their souls through forbidden orgies. Women were charged with seducing priests into sin. Every rumor was fuel for fear, every accusation a spark of fire. But perhaps the most haunting truth of medieval sexuality was this: it was never private. Desire, when discovered, was always made public, whether through punishment in the square, parades of shame, or the roaring flames of execution. The body became theater. Sin was not hidden, it was displayed, and the crowd loved the spectacle. Picture it: a woman forced to wear a shame mask, stumbling to the marketplace as children laugh. A man naked, chained to his lover, buried alive while neighbors watch. A witch, stripped, tied to the stake, flames licking her skin as the church bells toll. These were not isolated events. They were rituals repeated across centuries, across kingdoms, across a continent obsessed with controlling the flesh. The medieval world was a stage where sex and punishment played out side by side, where desire was both condemned and celebrated, where flesh was both sacred and sinful. By the 15th century, these contradictions had reached their peak, leaving behind stories so bizarre, so disturbing, that they echo even today. To understand the final shadows of this era, we must return once more to the strange punishments that society inflicted in the name of morality. Among the most terrifying was the ordeal of hot iron. A woman accused of adultery or fornication might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar across a set distance. If her hands healed clean, she was declared innocent, proof, they said, of God's mercy. If not, she was condemned. Imagine the burns, the screams, the lingering scars, all to test whether love or lust had truly crossed a forbidden line. Equally cruel was the punishment of trial by water. Those accused of sexual sins, especially women, were bound and thrown into rivers or lakes. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent in death. If they floated, they were guilty, because the logic went, water rejected the sinful body. This punishment was not just deadly. It was a paradox, one that damned a person no matter the outcome. But punishment was not always about death. Sometimes it was about erasure. In Florence, men convicted of sodomy were stripped of citizenship, their names struck from public record, their property seized. They became ghosts in their own cities, erased not only from the present but from history itself. And yet, even as society tried to bury desire under shame and fire, the human hunger for forbidden never died. Behind the monastery walls, in the secret chambers of castles, in the hidden corners of taverns, strange practices flourished. Some nobles reveled in masochistic games, using whips, chains, and devices that blurred the line between pleasure and torture. Others held clandestine feasts where performers staged obscene plays, mocking the very morality that condemned them. The peasantry, too, had their outlets. In some regions, bawdy festivals celebrated fertility with shocking abandon. Men dressed as women, women dressed as men, and public displays of coupling, sometimes simulated, sometimes real, took place under cover of ritual. These festivals were tolerated, even encouraged, because they symbolized a renewal of the land. But to outsiders, they looked like chaos, like lust unchained. And then there were the bizarre beliefs about the body itself. Some medieval doctors insisted that women could not conceive unless they experienced pleasure, leading to strange advice about ensuring female satisfaction. Others believed that masturbation could cause blindness or madness, spreading fear of self-pleasure. Manuals warned men that spilling seed outside of marriage was a crime against God, punishable by eternal damnation. The body was not just flesh. It was a battlefield of superstition, fear, and desire. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of medieval sexuality was how often it turned into spectacle. The punishment of lust was never hidden. It was always made public. Executions drew crowds. Whippings filled town squares. Shame masks became entertainment for neighbors. The sins of the flesh became theater, a drama that reminded every onlooker of the dangers of desire. And yet, the fascination with sex only grew stronger. Pilgrims traveling across Europe collected not only holy relics, but obscene souvenirs. Tokens from brothels, erotic drawings, whispered tales of exotic practices in distant lands. The Silk Road brought strange texts and ideas from the East, fueling imaginations with visions of pleasure beyond the church's control. The forbidden became fantasy, and fantasy fed the hunger for more. As the Renaissance dawned, cracks began to appear in the old order. Art and literature started to embrace the body, celebrating flesh not as sin but as beauty. Painters like Botticelli and sculptors like Michelangelo revealed the naked form in ways unthinkable in earlier centuries. Erotic poetry circulated more freely, disguised as classical revival. The old medieval punishments did not vanish overnight, but slowly, society began to shift. Desire was no longer only a crime. It was becoming a subject of art, philosophy, and even science. Still, the legacy of medieval sexuality lingers. The obsession with controlling the body, with policing desire, with turning private sin into public spectacle. It shaped centuries of culture. Even today, echoes remain in laws and taboos, in the way societies wrestle with questions of morality and flesh. Think of the chastity belt, whether myth or reality. It survives in our imagination as a symbol of control, of fear of female desire. Think of the witch trials, where accusations of sexual deviance fuel fires that consume thousands. Think of the public shaming, the masks, the parades of humiliation, echoes of which still exist in the way society punishes those it deems immoral. The medieval world teaches us a haunting truth. The more society fears desire, the more it obsesses over it. Every punishment, every ritual, every law revealed not just fear of sin, but fascination with it. The medieval mind could not stop thinking about sex, even as it tried to bury it in chains and fire. And so, as we step back from this dark journey, we see the Middle Ages not only as a time of knights and kings, but as a time when the flesh itself was on trial, where desire was a crime, where love could mean death, where shame was entertainment, and where the body was never truly free. Picture one last time. A town square filled with people, a woman strapped into a shame mask, stumbling as the crowd jeers. A man and woman buried alive together, clutching each other in terror as earth fills their lungs. A witch, her naked body tied to a stake, flames rising as her screams echo into the night. These were not stories whispered in shadows. They were public truths, carved into the very heart of medieval life. And yet, beneath it all, the flesh endured. Desire survived. Love found ways to grow in the cracks of fear. And from that darkness, from that obsession, from that cruelty came the seeds of change. The Middle Ages ended, but the memory of its bizarre practices did not. They live on, in the stories we tell, in the warnings we whisper, in the fascination we cannot escape. For the medieval world may be gone, but its shadows still cling to us, reminding us that the battle between sin and desire, between punishment and pleasure, is as old as humanity itself.